All right. Well, let's move on to Molly's talk here. Again, it's on the structural origin of the Anadarko Basin. Molly's broadcasting live from Oklahoma City. And Molly has 10 years of oil and gas experience, and she's a subject matter expert in structural geology. She has had the opportunity to work multiple basins in the U.S., including the Anadarko, Ardmore, Powder, Appalachian, onshore Gulf Coast, and the Rocky Mountain basins. She received her PhD from University of Oklahoma in 2019, and her passions are mentoring and teaching, but her favorite role is leading structural geology field courses in Nevada and Southern Oklahoma. Molly is currently a team member of Applied Stratigraphics as their structural geology expert, along with consulting for Turko tectonics and structural geology. Also, Molly will actually be giving a course to us later on this year in November or October. We haven't picked out a date yet exactly, but it'll be another foundational course, another 2-day webinar on the introduction to structural map basics. It'll be in conjunction with Applied Stratigraphics. So welcome, Molly, and take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Let me share my screen and get this presentation going. All right.
So, sorry, Molly, just as a reminder, if anybody has any questions, just please load them up into the chat window, and then we'll field questions at the end of the presentation, and I'll pitch them to Molly at the end of the presentation. All right, sorry about that.
Awesome. No, that sounds good. Everything look okay? You can see my screen and pointer?
Yep, sure can.
Awesome. Well, big congratulations to Tricia. That was really awesome to hear a little bit about your story and what you're teaching. Teachers are just so inspirational, and they can really drive a child or a young adult's future. So that was pretty cool to get to see her receive that reward today. So for today's talk, I'm going to be discussing the structural origin of the Anadarko Basin. And just to the south of the Anadarko Basin is the Wichita Uplift. At the surface where the mountains crop out, we call them the Wichita Mountains. So that's what you're seeing in the background. And that has a pretty good tectonic story behind it that's going to be included in this talk. So a little bit about me. I did get my PhD from the University of Oklahoma, where I studied under Dr. Mitra. And I did my dissertation on a structural analysis of the Wichita Uplift and structures in the Anadarko Basin. So a lot of that is going to be incorporated into the talk today. And as Pete mentioned, I've had a lot of years in the oil and gas industry, had a lot of years with Chesapeake Energy, and currently doing work with Devon Energy in Oklahoma City. But one of my favorite things is leading those structural geology field courses. So whenever it becomes offered again, I would love to have some of you all sign up for my structural geology field trip in Nevada. And then I also offer one in Southern Oklahoma, Arkansas as well. So the Anadarko Basin. Oh, one other thing that I forgot to mention too. With Applied Stratigraphics, we do a lot of in-house teaching and consulting. And I do work with some pretty great people. We all have our own specialties. So if you want to see what all we do, visit stratigraphyhelp.com. And they also offer some really awesome field courses. I know a few are coming up this fall, so definitely check them out if you get a chance. Okay, now back to the Anadarko Basin. If you are not familiar with where that is located, it is here within the central United States. The southern part of the Anadarko Basin, that's where we have a lot of oil and gas activity. That sits here within Oklahoma, outlined in red. It's actually considered a super basin. It's the 5th largest natural gas area in the US. And some fun facts, the world's deepest well was drilled back in 1974 to 79. That was the Bertha Rogers well. Another fun fact, they wanted to go deeper, but they actually encountered liquid sulfur that destroyed the bit. So would have been kind of fun to be part of that adventure. Very deep well for that time. And wasn't quite born yet, but not too long after that, I came along. So Anadarko Basin is a pretty important basin for Oklahoma, as well as the oil and gas industry. And for this talk, I'm going to kind of break it down into two parts. So for part one, we're going to be looking at the basement rocks, the tectonic history, but we're really going to be focused on the structural evolution of the Wichita Uplift, because that plays a lot into the structures that we see in the Anadarko Basin. And then for part two, we'll kind of get away from those structures near the Wichita Uplift and look more at the structures on the Anadarko Shelf. We're going to be talking about the origin of those structures, which is pretty important, and then kind of try to relate that back to some of the petroleum system elements and geologic risks. So the tectonic history can really be divided into three main events. First was back during the Precambrian and Cambrian, we had a failed rift ripped through this area. After that, we had the post-rifting stage, the post-rift subsidence. So we'll take a look at this, but pretty significant carbonate deposition during that time. And then during the Pennsylvanian, we had the structural inversion of this rift. And then this is kind of a schematic of what it looks like today, where the Wichita Mountains crop out at the surface. So let's start with the basement rocks. Always want to start with your basement up and go back as far as you can go. So here in the central US, where you see Oklahoma outlined in red, that's the Mesalzal province, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So about 1.6 GA crust that consists of continental margin volcanic arcs and back arc related supercrustal successions. It was then intruded about 1.4 GA with granitoids. So that's essentially what's making up our foundation, where you see these blue and green colors along this northeast southwest trend. Now, another important basement feature in Oklahoma is the impact of the mid-continent rift. So this is a little bit younger, about 1.2 GA. And if you look at the gravity map, you can see this bright feature here. That's the mid-continent rift. And there are some publications that have suggested that a part of it actually extends down into Oklahoma. So where you see this black square, that's essentially this area outlined here. And you'll notice that some of these basement rocks that they've colored in here, they're classifying those as being related to that mid-continent rift. So after the mid-continent rift, the next big thing to really impact this area was the breakup of essentially Rodinia. So this occurred in the late Precambrian, and particularly for Oklahoma here during the Cambrian. So as these continents split apart, there was a little arm of this rift that extended into southern Oklahoma. As that arm essentially tore apart, what happened is we had this mantle upwelling, and that resulted in the emplacement of a large igneous province. This igneous province stands out pretty nicely on both gravity and magnetic data. So just kind of quickly going back to that gravity data, where you see those bright pink colors, that represents the approximate area of the failed rift during the Precambrian to Cambrian. Now, after this time, we had what is sometimes called the Great American Carbonate Bank. So we had lots of carbonate deposition over the United States. And if you look at where that failed rift was, now that failed rift is undergoing cooling and subsidence. So if you were to take a cross section across this rift here in southern Oklahoma, prior to the Pennsylvanian uplift, what you would have seen is fairly thick carbonate deposition of the Arbuckle and Ellenberger, as well as some of these other carbonates like the Viola, some of these more famous carbonates. So just kind of looking at some subsidence curves, these are a nice way to kind of help understand some of the tectonic events that really impact deposition. So this is from the Bertha Rogers well, so that really, really deep well that I just discussed. And what you'll notice are several trends in that subsidence. We have a nice general trend up here. This essentially is representing our post-rift thermal subsidence. And that occurred through about the mid-Carboniferous. So the Carboniferous, that's going to consist of our Mississippian and our Pennsylvanian. And I had kind of mentioned the Pennsylvanian orogeny. So during this time, we had the structural inversion of the rift. We had the Pennsylvanian orogeny. And that resulted in these subsidence curves that are a little bit more rapid compared to the post-rift thermal subsidence. Continuing on, we see a little bit of impact during the Cretaceous. I don't think it was a huge impact, kind of just deposition and erosion. And I'm relatively speaking to the impact of the Pennsylvanian orogeny. So let's go back and take a quick look at the Pennsylvanian orogeny and some of the impact of the structures that developed. So this is a Blakey paleogeographic map from the late Pennsylvanian. And just to kind of get you oriented, here's the outline of Oklahoma. In southern Oklahoma, we have the Wichita Uplift. During this time, we also had the uplift of the ancestral Rocky Mountains. Traditional literature proposes that these uplifts could have been a result of the collision between North America and Africa/South America. So that would have essentially resulted in a northwest directed stress. However, much of the deformation along this front, this is the Appalachia-Ouachita Marathon front, a lot of that deformation is considered thin skin. So when something is called thin skin, it means the basement is not necessarily involved. And I'm kind of just referring to this front part around here. I'm sure that as we get farther back, you do get some basement involvement. Some more recent publications in the literature from 2017 have actually proposed that the ancestral Rocky Mountains, which would include the Wichita Uplift, are due to intraplate tectonics along the western and southwestern margins of North America, along with the Ouachita margin. And that it was these plate interactions that actually resulted in a northeast directed stress. Now, this is something that I tend to agree with. I think there's a lot more work that can be done. But generally speaking, I tend to agree with this interpretation based on my studies here in the Wichita Uplift. So I spent a lot of years studying the Wichita Uplift, and my main study area was located here within this red rectangle. I have lots of publications, or well, not lots, I have a few publications, and if you're interested in any of those, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to send you those PDFs. But the study included a significant amount of 2D and 3D seismic data, along with the well data, gravity magnetic data, as well as surface geology. And as part of this study, we developed a tectonic model, so that's something that I'll go over as well. Using this data set, I created a pretty regional structure map on top of the Arbuckle. So the Arbuckle is the carbonate rock that sits pretty much directly on top of the basement for the most part. And the Wichita Uplift extends northwest, southeast through here. Where the Wichita Mountains crop out at the surface, that's where you see these red and orange colors. This white area in the background, that's where the Arbuckle has been eroded. So a lot of the faults that you're seeing in this region are at the top of the basement, whereas here they're at the top of the Arbuckle. The deepest part of the Anadarko Basin is here just to the north of the Wichita Uplift. And in blue are a series of regional cross sections. I have several other talks available on YouTube where I walk through these, and they're also published in those publications I mentioned. But I do want to go ahead and point out two regional cross sections. And then after I do that, we'll kind of zoom into this area in the second red rectangle, the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin. because that really plays into the tectonic history. And those cross sections do a nice job kind of showing the evolution of those structures. So we'll start by looking at cross section A. This extends over a part of the Wichita Uplift, over this east-west oriented Ouachita Valley Fault system, and into a small field, the Carter-Knox Field. So this is one of the cross sections that we really focused on first. And just to kind of orient you, where you see these colored rocks, so there's purple, green, orange, those essentially represent our Pennsylvanian section. Our Pennsylvanian section is dominated by thin bedded clastics for the most part. And then below that is what's called the Springer Shale, so a relatively thick shale deposition. And then right below that, for the most part, that consists of our pre-Pennsylvanian section. And our pre-Pennsylvanian section is dominated by those thick bedded carbonates. You can see the Arbuckle down here. And then below that in orange is our basement rock. So the main fault responsible for the Wichita Uplift is the Wichita Mountain Fault, shown here. And as this fault progressed towards the surface, it started to flatten once it found that Springer Shale layer. That flattening then allowed for a significant amount of slip to be transferred into the basin. That slip was transferred along a detachment here near the base of the Springer Shale, and that resulted in several structures in the basin, one of those being the Carter-Knox anticline shown here. Now, we classified the Carter-Knox anticline as a faulted detachment fold, and that faulted detachment fold overlays a deeper fault-related fold within the pre-Pennsylvanian section. We identified another detachment near the base of the Arbuckle. Both of these can be linked back to the frontal faults of the Wichita Uplift. Now, what you also see in the cross-section are several basement-rooted normal faults. We actually feel that those are likely remnant from the rifting stage, and that the orientation and location of those could have actually controlled some of these later structures. They may have acted as a buttress to slip along some of these detachments, resulting in those structures to form where they did and at those orientations. Now there's another structure here in the central part of the cross section. This is the Ouachita Valley Fault Zone. This is more of an east-west trending fault. And I'll get into detail about this once we get into the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin. But I'll go ahead and tell you for now, we believe one of those basement-rooted normal faults became reactivated with a component of left lateral strike slip. And when we study this fault system, in this case, what we see is where the Ouachita Valley Fault propagates up through the section, it developed a small graben. This graben is actually filled with Virgilian age stratigraphy, which is very late Pennsylvanian. So we feel like the timing on the Ouachita Valley Fault, when it had that strike slip motion, that could have been very late in the Pennsylvanian. And then this deeper folded structure here, that likely occurred earlier in the evolution of this cross section as this fault was progressing towards the surface. So lots of impact on structures in the southern part of the basin from the Wichita Uplift. Now let's compare that with a cross section on the western part of the Wichita Uplift. So now you're looking at cross section F. Here we tend to get more of a stacked thrust fault geometry, sometimes referred to as a tri-shear geometry. And we've had pretty significant faulting and folding during the early parts of the pen. This is the Sentinel anticline, which is simply an overturned faulted fold. But what you'll notice is that this faulted fold becomes truncated by an unconformity at the base of the Demoinian, this kind of green layer here. And the Demoinian is about mid-Pennsylvanian time. So we had pretty significant faulting and folding during the early parts of the pen. and then some truncation during the middle parts of the pen. However, as you get into the Missourian and the Virgilian, very late Pennsylvanian age stratigraphy, those tend to onlap the Wichita uplift. And then if you really study some of these faults here on the very left part of the seismic line, you can actually see that those faults are cutting that stratigraphy. So we still had activity along this Wichita Mountain Fault that continued through the late parts of the Pennsylvanian. So that's kind of a quick summary of the regional part of this project. Now I want to zoom in and look at the Southeast Anadarko Basin, where we can see a little bit more detail in those structures and a little bit more detail in that structural evolution. So now we're zooming into the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin. And this is a map on the Sycamore, which is the very upper part of the pre-Pennsylvanian section. So Sycamore is going to be Mississippian in age. And there's pretty good 3D seismic coverage here where you see this dashed blue line. That's our 3D seismic coverage. And then for this part of the project, we have a lot of smaller cross sections that you'll see shown here in red. And the key thing to point out about this area is that there are essentially two main fault trends. You have this classic northwest-southeast trend. We have the Wichita Mountain Fault shown here, and then several other northwest-southeast trending faults out here in the basin as well. And then there are two pretty dominant, more or less east-west trending faults, one of those being the Cement Fault trend shown here, and the other being the Washita Valley Fault, which if you were to continue that fault system towards the right, eventually that would crop out here in the Arbuckle Uplift. So we have some pretty famous oil and gas fields down here, and we have some cross sections over these fields. And let's just take a quick look at what those cross sections look like. I'm gonna kind of separate these by the fields that run more northwest, southeast, and then the cross sections that run a little bit more east-west along these two fault trends. So these upper three panels, those represent the northwest-southeast structures. Here's Carter Knox Field again. And for each of these, we would classify those as faulted detachment folds. They look very similar to what could also be called fault propagation folds. But when you have a faulted detachment fold, what you're suggesting is that you get some folding before the faulting, whereas with a fault propagation fold, you're suggesting a fold is caused by that faulting. So in theory, you wouldn't get any folding before the faulting. But because that Springer shale layer is relatively thick, we feel like that's acting as a fairly thick detachment. So when we do restorations of these cross sections, we are able to see some of that folding before the faulting, which led us to classify these as faulted detachment folds. And that's pretty much going to be limited to the Pennsylvanian age section, which if you remember is dominated by thin bedded clastics. Below each of these, we have a fault related fold, and I would be okay with calling this more like a fault propagation fold. And these occur within our pre-Pennsylvanian carbonates, which is dominated by our thick bedded clastics. So that mechanical stratigraphy is really impacting the type of folding you're getting above and below. And if you remember from that first cross section I showed, as that Wichita Mountain Fault propagated up towards the surface, it flattened along the Springer, and that transferred slip into the basin. There was actually a forward shear kind of motion on that, which resulted in a greater amount of slip to be transferred higher in the section versus lower. Now these bottom three panels each represent cross sections over those east-west structures. So these two cross sections here, these essentially run parallel. This one here on the left extends over the cement field where we have an anticlinal structure. And then this one is just to the west outside of the folded structure, but still along that cement fault. So the cement anticline is going to be very similar to the structures that we saw up here. We could classify this as a faulted detachment fold that overlays a deeper fault-related fold. But the big catch here is that the cement fault runs more east-west. And in these cross sections, we believe we see a basement-rooted normal fault that became reactivated with a component of left lateral strike slip. And when you had that strike slip motion, that allowed for a graben to cut the crest of the cement anticline. These grabens are filled with Virgilian age stratigraphy, which was very late Pennsylvanian. So the timing of that strike slip motion would have been very late in the Pennsylvanian, allowing that graben to form, indicating the timing on that fault movement. This yellow dashed line, that's an unconformity at the base of the Permian. And in most of these cross sections, it's relatively flat lying. So that indicates that a lot of this fault movement would have been during the late parts of the Pennsylvanian. And then this is a great cross section. So this is outside of the folded structure, but still along that cement fault. What we see is that the units across here are relatively uniform, except for this little section right in here. And once again, that represents our Virgilian age stratigraphy. So the timing on this fault where we had some strike slip accompanied by some normal slip, allowing that graben to form, that would have occurred during the Virgilian. And once again, that Permian unconformity is relatively flat lying over that structure. Now this cross section here on the right, this is my favorite cross section in all of southern Oklahoma. So let's blow this one up and take a good look at it. The reason I love it so much is because I feel like it really tells the whole story, the whole tectonic evolution of the basin. So let me kind of break it down. So what you're looking at is a near vertical fault cutting this structure. Here on the right side, this is actually the southeast end of the Carter Knox field. So we saw the Carter Knox anticline here. Now you're kind of looking at the southern tip. You can kind of ignore this deeper part. So along the Carter Knox field, that deeper fault-related fold, that actually changes virgins near the southern part of the field. So you can kind of just ignore that in relation to this structure here. But what we see is some pretty intense folding of these units and faulting. So you have a pretty significant thrust fault coming through here. This is likely occurring on a detachment on top of the basement, probably within the lower part of the arbuckle somewhere. That's resulting in a pretty significant faulted fold to develop. And the units that are folded are our pre-Pennsylvanian section, as well as our early Pennsylvanian stratigraphy. So pretty intense folding in the Morrowan and the Atokan stratigraphy. This pink dashed line, that's an unconformity at the base of the Devonian, so about the mid-Pennsylvanian. And what you'll notice is that you still have folding. These units are still folded, not quite as intense as the earlier parts. Once you get up here, this consists of our Missourian and our Virgilian age stratigraphy, so things that are relatively late in the Pennsylvanian. What you'll notice is these are relatively flat lying over this deeper faulted folded structure. However, these units do become cut by this near vertical fault, the Ouachita Valley fault. So these don't really show that deeper folding, but they are cut by the Ouachita Valley fault. Now here on the southeast end of the Carter Knox, there's a normal fault that essentially cuts that southern limb. You know that by a well that has missing sections shown here. And that normal fault likely links down into this Ouachita Valley fault system. Now what you'll notice is that where you have the Permian unconformity in this yellow dashed line, that's relatively flat across this section. And below that, where you have this kind of teal color and this orange, all of this area in here represents Virgilian age stratigraphy. So the timing of strike slip movement along this Ouachita Valley fault that resulted in this fairly large graben to form, the timing on that is going to be very late in the Pennsylvanian during the Virgilian primarily. Now, if I take this cross section and I move to the west just a bit, now I'm outside of the folded structure of the Doyle field. So I'm outside of that folding, and I really get a lot better picture of the geometry of the Ouachita Valley strike slip fault in the subsurface. So once again, you can see this huge growth section. So we have the unconformity at the base of the Permian, and from there all the way to the top of this purple horizon, so that's the top of the Missourian, you have a significant growth section. So the timing on this strike slip fault, which allowed for that graben to form, would have been during the very late parts of the Pennsylvanian, whereas the timing for this tight faulting and folding to develop, that would have been during the early parts of the Pennsylvanian. And just kind of very quickly, what we believe is happening is that the Ouachita Valley Fault is a left lateral strike slip fault. And at this location, you get a left step. So there's an old rule of thumb. When you get a left step along a left lateral strike slip fault, that can result in a little pull apart graben, a releasing bend, and then the opposite happens. So if you take a right step, you can get a pop up or a restraining bend. So what does this mean for the tectonic evolution of southern Oklahoma? Well, when we studied transpressional models, what we found is that the style of deformation, whether that's more thrust faulting or more strike slip faulting, that style of deformation is determined by the angle of convergence, where the angle of convergence is the angle between a pre-existing structure and the orientation of your maximum horizontal stress. So where you get a higher angle of convergence, you get more thrust faulting. Where you get a lower angle of convergence, you get more strike slip faulting. So what we propose is that during the early parts of the Pennsylvanian, say from the Moroan through maybe the Des Moines, your maximum horizontal stress was oriented more or less northeast, southwest. That allowed for contractional deformation, so thrust faulting, on both the more east-west oriented structures as well as the northwest, southeast oriented structures. But what we propose is that by the time you get to the late Pennsylvanian, that maximum horizontal stress rotated slightly to become a little bit more east-northeast. That then allowed for contractional deformation and thrust faulting to continue on those northeast, northwest, southeast structures, whereas the more east-west structures underwent a component of strike slip deformation. So with this information in mind, we came up with a tectonic model for the area. The tectonic model is represented by a block diagram, and these are constructed at the basement level, so they don't represent that thin skin deformation, those faulted detachment folds. This is simply what could have been occurring at the basement level. And these block diagrams span essentially where we have the Wichita Mountains, so the western part of the Wichita uplift, over into the very western parts of the Arbuckle uplift. So let's just take a look at each one of these. So this first block diagram represents what the basement could have looked like at the end of the rifting phase. So we have several more or less possible regional rift faults with general trends, likely have some faults in the base, in the more the basement part as well. By the time we get to the early parts of the Pennsylvanian and we had the structural inversion of this rift, that occurred under northeast, southwest directed stress. That resulted in a lot of contractional deformation along these faults. And then by the time we get to the very late parts of the Pennsylvanian, our stress rotated to become a little bit more east-northeast. That then allowed for strike slip deformation to cut some of these more east-west trending faults. And that also allowed for contractional deformation to continue on the more northwest, southeast segments. So to summarize part one, we concluded that the Precambrian to Cambrian felled rift laid the foundation for the later Pennsylvanian age structures, that the basement-rooted normal faults were either reactivated or controlled the location of Pennsylvanian age structures. Deformation during the early part of the Pennsylvanian was primarily contractional, and that occurred when your maximum horizontal stress was likely oriented northeast, southwest. During this time, the frontal faults of the Wichita uplift transferred slip into the Anadarko Basin. That occurred on detachments at the base of the Springer and Arbuckle. We had our thin skin structures develop, and then we also had that forward shear motion on the frontal faults of the Wichita uplift. That allowed for a greater amount of slip to be transferred higher in the section. By the time we get to the late Pennsylvanian, we propose that your stress is rotated to become a little bit more east-northeast. That resulted in contractional deformation on the northwest-southeast structures for that to continue, whereas the more east-west oriented faults could then undergo a component of strike-slip deformation. So that's a good summary of what we concluded with the Wichita uplift and structures in the southern part of the Anadarko Basin. And for part two of this talk, I do want to discuss some of the structures that we actually see in the Anadarko Basin as well. So what do I mean by Anadarko Basin? So if you look at this map down here, where we have the Wichita uplift, that's kind of shown in red. Then we have the very southern part of the Anadarko Basin where we saw a lot of those thrust faults and a lot of that deformation we just talked about. But when I'm referring to structures on the Anadarko Basin or shelf area, I'm really kind of talking about structures here in central and more northern Oklahoma. Structures up here tend to consist of fairly high angle faults. A lot of these have a component of strike slip, both with normal and reverse slip seen in the basin. And also, if you kind of look at this generic fault map, a lot of these tend to be northeast, southwest, and then there's a few east-west trends in there. The structures are definitely more subtle than what we just looked at in the southern part of the basin. A lot of times, high-resolution seismic data is necessary to map those geometries, which can then be accentuated or highlighted by using some of those seismic attributes. So here's a seismic line from the central part of Oklahoma. And I've even vertically exaggerated this 4 times. So cut this in half by 4, and that's how little some of these structures are. Yet these structures play a huge role on operations and development, as well as some of the geologic risks in the basin. So here's our Arbuckle and our Woodford. This big line, that's about a mid-Pennsylvanian, so that's about Des Moinesian. And then you can see where the Permian sits up here, just for reference to what we just looked at. Now, once we get into the central and northern parts of the Anadarko Basin, it's really important to consider the origin of those structures. So we'll start by talking about what those structures look like if their origins could be related to Pennsylvanian tectonics. And then we'll quickly touch on a few other possibilities. Could those structures originated during basin subsidence? Was that subsidence during the Precambrian rifting, or was that subsidence during the Pennsylvanian orogeny? And we do have some pretty neat basement structures that are very old, so we'll take a quick look at those. And even some of those got reactivated. Reactivation, so that's a pretty important word. You also want to consider the reactivation of any of these structures as well. So the key to understanding structures on the Anadarko shelf is understanding the kinematics. And there are a few vital concepts for understanding these more subtle structures. The first is understanding stress regimes and fault models. So we'll take a look at exactly what that is in the next slide. And then as I kind of just showed you in that first part, you really want to consider models of transpression and transtension. And in this case, I'm pretty much referring to pre-existing structures being reactivated with either a component of transpression or transtension. In the Anadarko Basin, it's good to have those concepts related to strike slip, so we'll talk about those. And also your tectonic history, especially when you've had multiple events, that can be really important for understanding structure because a lot of those structures can become reactivated. And then another pretty important concept is this concept of penetrative strain, which I'll go over that as well. But first, a very simple concept, make sure you understand your stress regimes, whether that's a paleo stress regime or a modern day stress regime. And we typically break our stress regimes out by calling it a normal faulting regime, a reverse faulting regime, or a strike slip faulting regime. But what do we really mean by that? Well, if you think about a cube of rock, you essentially have your three principal stresses acting on those. Those three principal stresses include both a magnitude and a direction. So our magnitudes are pretty much classified as S1, S2, or S3. And the directions are always typically going to be vertical and then 2 in the horizontal. And when one of your horizontals is greater than the other, we call it SH max. So stress regime refers to how the rocks will break if your stresses are stronger than the rock strength. So once this S3 becomes greater than the strength of the rock, that rock is going to want to break or fault. And how that rock breaks is going to be determined by what stress regime you're in. So if you're in a normal faulting regime, your S1 is vertical, and your faults pretty much want to form at 30 degrees to vertical, which if you measure from horizontal, that's typically a 60-degree dipping normal fault. If you're in a reverse faulting regime, your maximum stress is horizontal and your minimum stress is vertical. So it's easier to push those rocks up, which is why we get our nice reverse faults. In strike slip faulting, S1 is horizontal and S3 is also horizontal. So it's easy to open those rocks. And the orientation at which those faults will form is 30 degrees to S1. That's usually most optimal. But then if you're measuring from horizontal, of course, strike slip faults are typically seen as vertical. So understanding some very basic ideas about stress regimes, the orientation of your stresses compared to the magnitudes, that can really help set up some expectations of the type of structures you might see in your basin. Just think about, is it paleo stress you're looking at or modern day or neo stress? The other thing is the kinematics of strike slip. So there are some old classic strain ellipse models that are really helpful. So if you consider the orientation of your maximum horizontal stress, these are great for trying to figure out the orientation of what you expect a master fault to form at. This little R, that's a right L shear. Those are very, very common. We see those quite a bit, and those form at the same orientation or sense of slip direction, so right lateral with a through going right lateral. These anti-right Ls, those form with an opposite slip direction. If you get normal faulting in your basin, you expect that to form parallel, and if you get reverse faulting, perpendicular. There are some nice diagrams out there on the type of structures you can expect, like horsetail splays. If you have a right lateral strike slip fault with a right step, you get your releasing bend or those grobins. If you have a left step, you get your restraining bends. So it can be really helpful to kind of understand these concepts related to strike slip faulting to help set up some of those expectations. Now, this is a concept that I feel like is going to be very important to any foreland or foreland-like basin. It's the concept of penetrative strain. And penetrative strain, that constitutes the proportion of total shortening across an origin that is not accommodated by macro scale structures such as folds and thrusts. So if you take this clay cake model here on the left side, and if you push along this wall and you essentially compress that, what you'll see is you'll have this little area where you have your fold and your thrust fault deformation. So that would definitely be a reverse faulting regime. If you look at that in cross-section view, you'll see nice thrust faults, nice folds developing. Eventually, once you get far enough away from your origin, you'll see an area that's undeformed. So if you look at the color scale in this cross-section, where you see blue, those are areas that are undergoing contraction. Red is tension, but we don't really see true tension here, but you do see this kind of white, this neutral area. That would represent an area that's undeformed. So in this case, you don't have those tectonic stresses. You're essentially in a normal faulting regime where your S1 is vertical. And if you look at these little strain ellipses on this clay cake model, what you'll see is these ellipses down here are essentially undeformed. But between this thrust wedge and these undeformed ellipses, you'll see an area where the strain ellipses are ever so slightly squeezed. Well, that's an area where you still have that strong horizontal stress, but it's not quite high enough to create thrust faulting or folding. So in this area here, this would essentially represent a region of where we would expect strike slip faulting. So this would represent our strike slip faulting regime out in front of that orogenic front where we see that thrust faulting. So let's see if that holds true for the Anadarko Basin. So I have just a couple of literature examples where they put some seismic data out there and I grabbed. So this is an example from the central part of the basin. What we see is that the faults here tend to be very close to vertical. Here's one where they drew some interpretations on. And this is their structure map. What you'll notice is a bit of a northeast-southwest trend. So these also have a component of normal slip. So those could either represent some normal faulting in the basin or those right L shears. Those a lot of times have a component of normal slip with those as those step. Based on those orientations, to me, that might suggest a northeast directed stress. I also did a nice little clay cake in this paper, and then they went back and looked at how that compared based on some of their seismic attributes in this 3D survey. And what they concluded, or what they showed in here, is that these little northeast, southwest lineaments, those essentially represent your right L shears, and then you have your through-going master fault. And all of this together, using what we learned from the strain ellipse, this would suggest a northeast directed stress felt in the Anadarko Basin. And based on the structural style, these would represent strike slip faults. So it's very likely that these formed during the Pennsylvania orogeny. They formed out in front of where we get any major thrust faulting or folding. So they likely represent that region of strike slip stress regimes. And then one more example from the literature. This is down here a little bit closer to what's known as the Nemaha fault. And this is a more or less a north-south oriented fault. But once again, we see the same thing. We see those strike slip faults in this 3D survey. We see a lot of those northeast, southwest little lineaments on here. A lot of those contain a small component of normal slip, so those would represent our little right L shears, those little stepping geometries. And if we place all that information on our handy strain ellipse, once again, this supports a northeast, southwest oriented stress. Now, I did look at seismic over the Nemaha fault, and what I saw along that fault, at least here in southern Oklahoma, is that much of that deformation occurred during the early parts of the Pennsylvanian. So a lot of this that you see filling in this graben here, that likely is going to represent a token in Moroan sediment, so very early in the Pennsylvanian. By the time we get a little bit more shallow, once we get into the Missourian, definitely the later parts of the Pennsylvanian, a lot of that stratigraphy was relatively flat lying over this fault. So a lot of these strike slip faults here could represent some of that early Pennsylvanian deformation. So quickly circling back around, you want to consider the origin of structures, because it is possible that you've had reactivation. So if you think about some of these origins just here in the Anadarko Basin, you could have had these basin subsidence faults that as you get either the Precambrian rifting phase or the Pennsylvania orogeny, you can get some flexure in the basin, and that would result in some of these deeper basement faults. It's very likely that some of those became reactivated during the later parts of the Penn, especially those more east-west trending ones. And then this is a paper that I was a part of where we looked at some of these Proterozoic faults. It's possible they were related to the Mid-Continent Rift, but they were very old faults. And they showed up nicely based on some of these offsets and basement reflectors. And some of these actually became reactivated. So kind of cool to see even those very old Proterozoic structures had an impact on Pennsylvania tectonics. And reactivation of structures, I think, is going to be key anywhere you go in the world. And I just have a few things to kind of indicate when something could have been reactivated. So if you think about those stress regimes, if the orientation is unexpected, then what you would expect, you might consider, am I looking at an older structure that's become reactivated? And if you're in an area where you have tectonic stratigraphy and things have not been completely eroded, you can look at your pre-syn and post-kinematic packages. And then also consider those transpressional models as a guide. You know, if you think about your paleo stresses and reactivation, do you expect more thrust faulting or maybe more normal faulting, or do you expect a component of strike slip? Let's set up some expectations. And some additional considerations is your mechanical stratigraphy. If you remember from the first part of the talk, we saw that our thin bedded clastics behaved a little bit differently than our thick bedded carbonates. So keep in mind your mechanical stratigraphy and how that might behave under stress. And then also consider the role of subseismic fracturing and faulting. So if you're looking for those fractures, or if you're looking for faults that are maybe subseismic, you might consider doing some structural modeling or some type of fracture studies. Basically, kinematics are going to be the key to understanding structures on the shelf. And these structures can act as traps. We saw some of those classic oil and gas fields, those macroscopic structures in the southern Anadarko Basin. And something that's relatively common here on the Anadarko Shelf, in some of the plays I've worked, we see these anomalous pods of production that don't really correspond to porosity or anything major that we're seeing by mapping out well data. But what we have seen is that you might get a little anomalous pod of production, say in the hanging wall of a fault. And that fault can be very small. Maybe I'm just thinking 30 feet is one example that we saw. And that was small enough to create a small little pod of production. And by using some 3D seismic data, we were able to essentially map that. Structure is going to be important to your migration pathways, as well as geologic risk. You want to consider if you have any seal breaches or leaky faults. And also a big one here in Oklahoma are operational loss or operational risks, such as mud loss and well connectivity. It's something that operators have struggled with before. And then another really big one is fault reactivation. So induced seismicity, finding those deep basement faults and figuring out where those are, that can sometimes be a challenge. So to summarize, I think I could summarize it in one word: structural geology is important, but having a basic understanding of kinematics is going to be crucial. We talked about the stress regimes, and we kind of went with the classic Andersonian fault models. Using those strain ellipse models for understanding strike slip structures and transpression, but really the key thing is to consider the reactivation of old structures. And also know your tectonic history. Go back as far as your basement rocks will let you. In this case, that was the Proterozoic from us, because it pretty much all starts from the basement up. And I know a lot of you might be in Colorado right now, but if you're ever in Oklahoma, I would definitely recommend going to the Wichita Mountains. So with that, I would like to thank you all for being here, and thank you to RMAG for hosting me today. You can find me on LinkedIn or email me if you want any of those references, and I will be happy to take on questions. Hopefully it's not too late in the day for you all.
No, that was awesome, Molly. That was very, very thorough. And like we had talked in our pre-meeting, I went to SMU and we spent a lot of time on the Wichita Mountains, and it was really exciting to get a refresher on it. And I really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of questions. One, reading it here off my screen. What do you consider to be the maximum left slip on the Washita fault system?
Oh, so that's a great question. And I would be happy to send you the reference where we looked at that. So in the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin, I think we kind of came up with maybe a ballpark of 9 miles, maybe up to 15 miles. And that was primarily based on mapping stratigraphic markers in the Virgilian and Missourian sediment. And if you remember, I had mentioned that a lot of that strike slip faulting happened during the late part of the Penn, during the late part of the Penn, during the Virgilian. But using those transpressional models, that doesn't mean that we didn't have some strike slip movement earlier. That's just what we could document within that stratigraphy. So that 9 to 15 miles, it could be a little bit larger once you get into that deeper stratigraphy, because what we were looking at was primarily within syndepositional stratigraphy, but it gave us a pretty good ballpark estimate. So hopefully that helps. And I'd be happy to send you that paper. We kind of break down the methods and how we did that.
Yeah, that was a question from Chuck Thorman. So I'm sure if he wants the reference, he can email you for it.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely do. I know your name and we've chatted before, so I'm happy to send you some of those references.
Another question, curious about the sub-Arbuckle detachment. Significant Reagan shale to carry this question. Do we see this in outcrop question? Could some of the deep structure be reactivation of rift faults?
So that is a great question. I think where the Arbuckle is acting as a detachment, it's not gonna necessarily crop out at the surface. Let me just go back to maybe this map here. So where we have the Arbuckle at the surface, we have that there in the Slick Hills, and we also have it a little bit on the Arbuckle anticline. But in those two localities, I don't know that you would need the Arbuckle to act as a detachment to get that up there, because you are being thrust up by that basement rock. Where I believe the Arbuckle is acting as a detachment is in the very deepest parts of the Anadarko Basin. So maybe, you know, here along the deep part of the thrust front, and then also here in the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin. Once you get out into the shallow, you don't need that detachment. So if you drilled a core or if you saw outcrop, you wouldn't necessarily see that. And within the Arbuckle stratigraphy, and I don't have an example handy to show, but within the Arbuckle stratigraphy, there are some parts, the very lower part, where you get a little bit more clay rich. So we kind of had some discussion as to whether that detachment was truly in the Arbuckle, in the lower parts of the Arbuckle. Was it between the Arbuckle and the Reagan? Was it between the Reagan and the basement? So there were some discussions about where that detachment would sit. And we don't have a great answer. Honestly, if somebody could drill a core to the basement, you know, where we're still within this folded thrust regime, I feel fairly confident we would be able to answer that question, but that would be a very deep core, very expensive, probably not going to happen. But where we do have the Arbuckle at the surface, I don't know that we would need it. I don't think that detachment would show up there, because you don't need that detachment up here to get these rocks up here. So I don't know if that would necessarily make sense. But in order to see that detachment, basically you would need to drill a core very deep down, going all the way to the basement. in this frontal part of the Wichita uplift, because that's where it's acting as a detachment. It's not necessarily acting as a detachment up here or in the shallow parts of the basement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's another question. You seem to avoid the terms positive and negative pop-up structures, flower structures, I guess. Are those terms no longer used?
I think those are fine ways to define it. Structures can go by many names. So when I teach on these strike slip structures, I might call it a negative flower structure, a releasing bend, a pull apart, or if it's a positive flower, a restraining bend, a pop up. I don't have any issues with the terminology. It's just kind of maybe what I go to in the moment, depending on what I'm looking at. But definitely those are fair terms to use as well.
Could you comment on any relationships to the subparallel Red River Matador tectonic zone?
Yeah, so that's a very tricky zone. I don't know a whole lot about it, but what I've postulated is that maybe there's something deeper there in the crust, some pre-existing east-west structure. And during the Pennsylvanian, there could have very well been some left lateral slip there. I would be very hesitant to say that it's a large left lateral slip system with major wrenching or anything like that. I don't think we see evidence for that, but we definitely see evidence for maybe small scale strike slip and maybe some little rotation blocks. And the reason it forms, like in that relatively linear east-west trend, maybe there's something deeper in the basement. If you ever study some of the more detailed magnetic data or gravity data, it's not just a very linear feature. It almost looks like some deeper volcanoes or something deeper in that crust that could have created some type of pre-existing weakness down there that maybe got reactivated. And since it's east-west, and I'm thinking of Pennsylvanian stresses, I kind of have my bias set up that those would have been north, east, southwest. So maybe some little left lateral fault blocks in there. It's my best guess.
Excellent quality displays in talk today, Molly, from Dave Alred. Thank you, he says. For my career, I saw an overuse of the term strike slip, originally defined in California through-going systems when oblique slip may do. You defended this very well from your mapped lateral offset answer to Chuck's question. So I think a good answer to a question. Another question here from Ron Parker. I'm curious as to the relationship of the Anadarko Basin to the Nemaha uplift. In Kansas, the Mid-Continent Rift is about 50 miles west of the Nemaha. Okay. Any chance the Precambrian basement faulting below the Anadarko are Mid-Continent Rift related?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Nemaha fault in southern Oklahoma is oriented north-south. And I kind of mentioned this in my talk. In the southern part of the basin, we do see that evidence for right lateral strike slip. And that would make sense with those northeast oriented right L shears. And the timing on that would have been during the early to mid Penn. And I know there are some papers in the literature that once you get into like Kansas and Nebraska, they actually describe the Nemaha structurally different. Maybe they describe it as left lateral strike slip or reverse or normal faulting. I know there's some debate in the literature, but I think the origin of that, I think the origin is debatable, but I definitely think it's possible it could have originated during the timing of the Mid-Continent Rift, maybe as like a broken piece of crust, but not necessarily something that was actually rifted and intruded with those deep basalts that really makes that high magnetic signature. I've always kind of just thought about it as maybe a broken piece of the crust that maybe got broken about the time of the Mid-Continent Rift. And then there are some studies, some theses, if you're interested, from University of Tulsa that actually did document some movement in Oklahoma on that fault during like the Viola, basically pre-Penn. So we know there's been activity or movement on that prior to the Pennsylvania orogeny. And then we know that during the Pennsylvania orogeny, it was likely a reactivated structure. versus something that originated during the pen. But once you get into like Kansas, Nebraska, I haven't studied it as much, but I definitely have thought about it, and I would be okay with thinking that it originated during the same mid-continent timing, maybe just something that was broken but not necessarily pulled apart and intruded by the salts that show up on those gravity and magnetic maps.
Well, that's it for questions, Molly. We really thank you. That was a very thorough presentation. I liked how you linked it to the ancestral Rockies. That definitely was, and RMAG, thank you, and appreciate it. Oh, one last question came in here. The gravity profile across the Neem uplift reservoir fall. I guess that was just a comment, but yeah, that concludes it. And thank you, Molly. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.